We must acknowledge that conditions for civilians in Gaza are catastrophic, and that this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe is both an immense tragedy and a threat to our national security.
Hey everyone, it's David, producer for The Benjamin Dixon Show, and like it or not. So the incredibly slow crawl, frustrating, unacceptable crawl towards calling for a ceasefire continues. We know there's a handful of progressives in the House that have called for a ceasefire, and I think there have been a couple in the Senate as well. Yesterday, John Ossoff of Georgia, he's 36 years old, he's Jewish, and you'll remember he was one of two senators that won incredibly close races in 2020 that decided control of the Senate for the Democrats. It was Ossoff and Warnock. Yesterday, Ossoff took to the Senate floor and addressed the crisis in Israel. He didn't call for a ceasefire. He didn't even call for a humanitarian pause. And while what he did say doesn't make the fact that he didn't call for a ceasefire acceptable, what he said and how he said it is compelling. I think it's really worth looking at, breaking down, and examining. I think that an elected official who is Jewish saying it with the emphasis and tone that he used is significant. And very importantly, I think he is one of only two Jewish politicians to call the crisis in Gaza what it is, a humanitarian disaster. So the speech was actually just under 10 minutes long. I've sped it up because he speaks very slowly. So I've broken this into parts, and just stick with me because there's some parts that I think you'll find surprising. The speech takes some turns.
Mr. President, when Hamas gunmen stormed into towns and kibbutzim in southern Israel and massacred over 1,000 Israeli civilians, killing families, raping women, abducting babies, torturing and beheading Jews in the very state that was established after the Holocaust to be their sanctuary. The overwhelming majority of Americans were and still are united in our grief, outrage, and solidarity with the Israeli people. For Jews, these events call to mind the Einsatzgruppen SS, the Nazi death squads, who hunted and massacred our relatives across Eastern Europe 80 years ago. The slaughter of Jews at such scale and with such cruelty reopened deep Jewish wounds suffered throughout our history.
So he started the speech in a way you would expect just about any person of Jewish faith, especially one that is a Zionist and that supports Israel. He opens the speech like you would expect. But I noticed a couple things that he didn't do. He didn't say that the death toll from October 7th was 1,400 because the numbers have started to change. I think at one point I saw that it was lowered to an estimate of about 1,200 people. So he's got it at over 1,000, acknowledging that things have changed and not repeating propaganda and talking points. Also, as he describes some of the heinous acts that Hamas committed on October 7th, and the brutality and, to be honest, twisted things that they did, doesn't repeat things that have not been proven, like the beheading of babies. Like he doesn't repeat that babies were beheaded. We know that there was cases of torture and beheadings, but he doesn't specify babies, which is really important because this would have been an opportunity that many other people would have taken to specify that and repeat that. And I think it's intentional that he did not. He just said Jews. I think he could have also said civilians. He didn't, again, not a word that he chose, though. So let's keep going.
Salt in those wounds was the minimization and even celebration of this massacre by a few, including a few in the United States, who attempted to excuse such atrocities as a righteous comeuppance for Israeli policies or the inevitable consequence of Israel's very existence. That moment required moral clarity. No matter one's objections to Israeli policy or one's perspective on history, there is no justification and can be no apology for the deliberate massacre and torture and abduction of civilians. There is no excuse, there is no context, historical or political, that mitigates the crime.
So it's really clear what he's doing here, but he's doing it in a way that doesn't instigate, that doesn't goad or egg on. It's not inflammatory. If you can't figure it out, he is acknowledging that some that stand with Palestinians have supported Hamas or have spoken in support of what Hamas did on October 7th. And he's saying that it's indefensible, that there is no defense for it. No matter if you're an anti-Zionist, he's saying that despite how you look at history, October 7th wasn't defensible, that only a handful have been vocally supportive of Hamas. The overall pro-Palestinian protests have not. They've been standing with the Palestinian people, calling for freedom, calling for them to have their rights, and the end of the apartheid and occupation policies. And the way he broke that down, I think it really stands out. All right, let's keep going.
It is clear that under such circumstances, Israel has an obligation to protect its citizens and a right to do so with force. And this, too, requires moral clarity. No government could be expected to tolerate such an attack and such a threat without taking decisive action to defend itself and to bring the perpetrators to justice. Mr. President, now 5 weeks since the October 7th massacre, Israel's military response, which is substantially armed by the United States, directly impacts the lives of millions of people, the future of the Middle East, and America's national security, and it is therefore a necessary subject of scrutiny by the U.S. Senate. And so, Mr. President, the Senate must acknowledge that conditions for civilians in Gaza are catastrophic, and that this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe is both an immense tragedy and a threat to our national security. Hamas embeds its military capabilities within Gaza's civilian infrastructure. It hides behind and beneath Gaza's civilian population. But the depraved tactics of Hamas do not relieve Israeli leaders of their obligations to protect innocent life, nor should they harden our hearts against the innocent people who live under their...
Achievable. But he specifically says what is happening in Gaza is a humanitarian catastrophe. And I think saying that in the position of a senator and saying it on the record in the Senate chambers is important. Is it just symbolic and void of an action? We'll have to see, how things go and how he votes on certain things. But I think it's still significant. It moves the ball a little bit and can impact how others respond as well.
In 5 weeks, relentless airstrikes and the continuous use of massive munitions in dense urban areas have killed thousands of civilians and seriously wounded many thousands more, including many children. In a territory half the size of DeKalb County, Georgia, tens of thousands of homes have been destroyed or damaged beyond use, and more than 1.5 million people have been displaced. Clean water, food, and medicine are scarce, and the continued obstruction of aid necessary for sanitation and health care will worsen suffering, disease, and death. Small children are wasting from malnutrition and falling ill in overcrowded shelters and makeshift camps. Imagine the desperation of families with young children just trying to survive. And this, too, Mr. President, requires moral clarity. The extent of civilian death and suffering in Gaza is unnecessary. It is a moral failure, and it should be unacceptable to the United States.
And this is where the speech starts to take a turn. Because this whole time he's been basically saying what one would expect for the most part from an official of Jewish faith. All the general talking points with a few small nuggets that stood out. But he's speaking very clearly to what is happening in Gaza.
There is no doubt that to defeat the threat posed by Hamas, force is required. And with the use of force, no matter how judicious, facing an enemy hiding behind civilians, there will be civilian casualties. But restraint and the acceptance of some military risk out of concern for innocent life are demonstrations of strength, even and especially when confronting a brutal enemy like Hamas. Concern for the innocent, especially when fighting an enemy unbound by any morality, demonstrates the values for which the U.S. should stand and which Israel proclaims, the same values meant to be the bedrock of our alliance. Mr. President, an unmitigated humanitarian disaster in Gaza is not just a moral failure. It undermines American national security. It heightens the risk that the war might spread and draw American forces further into combat. It sows the seeds of hate and dims the prospects for a long-term, sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It gives fodder to terrorists who would strike Americans and our allies abroad and at home. It damages the credibility of the United States and our allies as champions of a future defined by humanitarian values, the same values at stake in Ukraine, where Russia would push dictatorship into Europe, and in Asia, where China threatens the future of human freedom. If in 6 months Gaza is rubble, with tens of thousands of civilians dead and millions of desperate refugees with no viable plan to govern its ruins. That would be a disaster not just for all those killed and wounded and immiserated, but also for Israel, for the region. Mr. President, the United States has stood with Israel since October 7th, and still does. The President powerfully condemned Hamas atrocities. He flew to Israel while Israel was under fire. He rushed supplies to the IDF and sent powerful military assets to deter Iran and its proxies. Americans are working around the clock to secure the release of hundreds of hostages. Nevertheless, requests by the United States that the Israeli leadership conduct a more targeted campaign, that they permit and provide safe passage for aid essential to the sustenance of innocent life, that they clearly define objectives, that they prevent extrajudicial killings by extremists in the West Bank, that they present a credible plan for Gaza's future governance, have mostly been ignored. Mr. President, I fervently want Israel to succeed, both in defeating the threat posed by Hamas and as a historic effort to secure a safe homeland for Jews. But I do not accept that the total deprivation of millions of innocent civilians is necessary for Israel to secure its objectives or in the national interest of the United States. And where the United States is committing arms, funds, and support to those efforts, we must guard our principles and our interests. So, Mr. President, I urge Israel's political leaders to act with wisdom, to listen to Israel's greatest friend and ally, the United States. And, Mr. President, just as I pray for the freedom of hostages taken so cruelly from their families, as a pro-Israel Jewish American, I urge mercy for the innocent civilians in Gaza.
So did you catch what he did there, where he called out Israel for ignoring us completely?
Requests by the United States that the Israeli leadership conduct a more targeted campaign, that they permit and provide safe passage for aid essential to the sustenance of innocent life, that they clearly define objectives, that they prevent extrajudicial killings by extremists in the West Bank, that they present a credible plan for Gaza's future governance, have mostly been ignored.
Basically, Ossoff is saying here, despite everything that we're doing to support Israel, they're ignoring just the most basic things that we're pleading with them to do. And that is also really important that we recognize. Most politicians are just saying, yes, Israel should minimize to listen. Putting this into the conversation, into the dialogue, is in itself important. It puts pressure on others to speak out and probably gives more emphasis and legitimacy to the pushes happening behind the scenes. The speed of which all of this is happening is way too slow. The fact that Israel is rejecting all calls and continuously claiming there is no humanitarian crisis, claiming that whatever happens in Gaza is Hamas's fault, not theirs. The fact that they're doing all of this and the Biden administration is basically saying, hey, we're here, listen to us, we don't like what you're doing, but also, hey, here's some weapons, here's full support, we're not criticizing. It's really problematic. And I think that calling it out the way Ossoff did here, it can start to shift things. It won't shift things enough for most of the people that pay attention to this channel. It doesn't shift things fast enough for me, but it's still something that needs to be said and done. I'm by no means praising Ossoff's, I'm not praising this speech. I'm embracing it because it's a tone that is significantly better than what we're hearing from most others in the government. It at least spells out what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And while a lot of people are going to say it's just more lip service, the way he's doing it and the place he's doing it in matters. Anyway, let us know your thoughts. Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and we will be back.